Hi everyone, Daljeet here from astrolab21.com. Welcome back to our ongoing series on human design, an introduction to human design. This is going to be the seventh episode now in the series. And at this point, we've kind of moved past the introduction phase. I feel like the first 6 episodes, we really did cover all of the basics, all the fundamental components of what human design is when you're first coming to it, right? If you were just being introduced, maybe you're just starting your experiment, you got your first reading, and you really want to learn more about how this system works, what it's all about. And yeah, we covered the major bases in those first 6 episodes. We went through strategy and authority, and we talked about circuitry, we've talked about profile, we've talked about definition, we've talked about a lot of the basics. And so at this point, I think we're shifting from an introduction basics into sort of an intermediate phase, especially with the topic we're going to discuss today, which is Incarnation Crosses. And in some ways, they're the perfect bridge between the introduction and into more of an intermediate or advanced level of understanding human design and the Rave Mandala and all that entails. Because Incarnation Crosses is something that typically you will get some exposure to in a foundation reading. It's actually one of the fundamental components, but it really does pull in a much more advanced understanding of the mechanics, the mandala, the program, how all of this works. And it does move a little bit from what we would consider the very personal nature of knowing our chart to a much more impersonal force, if you will, in the consciousness field, in the consciousness program, as we would call it within the system. But it is a really fascinating topic, and I think one that people are always very interested in, because your incarnation cross is related to your purpose. And it seems most of us are really fascinated and want to know as much as we can about our sense of purpose. I think a part of it is culturally motivated. We're a very purposeful, driven type of society. And, I think a lot of us, especially those of us who are kind of seekers, who are aware and trying to grow and develop and evolve, we're really trying to always get to what is our purpose. I think some people are really blessed to know their purpose very early in life and to follow that unwaveringly from early age. But I think that's very rare. I think the majority of us sometimes struggle to find our purpose, and even at midlife and beyond, we're still wondering, is this my purpose? Is this what I'm really here to do? So yeah, incarnation crosses can be really helpful in elucidating that and really showing us, giving us a roadmap and a guide into how we can fulfill our purpose. So it's a big topic. It may end up being a 2-part video because there's a lot of ground to cover with this subject. And in order to actually explain incarnation crosses properly, we have to understand something called the quarters. And we really have to get back to some of the basic mechanics of the mandala and how it works. So in many ways, we'll be going back to where we started in the first episode when we looked at the fundamental 8 trigrams of the I Ching and how those are the real basic building blocks of the whole human design system in many ways. And I'm always a proponent of understanding the fundamentals. I think when you get a really solid foundation in anything that you're trying to learn, when you can learn it from the ground up, you really know. It's kind of a first line approach, right? It's foundational, it's fundamental. And I'm someone who has, I believe I have 6 first lines in my chart. So even though I'm a 3-5 by profile, I have a lot of first line energy, and I'm very obsessed at times with getting to the bottom of all of this. So that's what I'm sharing with you here. I think this whole series has a little bit of a first line theme to it in that way. I hope you're appreciating it and enjoying this content as it's being produced. And if you are, of course, I always ask that you just give it a thumbs up, like it, subscribe, leave a comment, talk about whether you're sharing your profile or what you've gotten out of the series, what you'd like to hear going forward in future episodes. just generating interest in the channel will help me spread the word and get this content to in front of more eyeballs, so more people can be, can have their lives changed, hopefully for the better, by having access to this information. All right, so as usual, I have a presentation. I'm going to jump into that now. And here I'm just pulling up what you would get. This is a basic free chart that you would get generated from jovianarchive.com, which is sort of the OG source for all things human design. This was the website that Ra himself set up, and I think his family still runs this to this day. But when you go and get a free body graph, it does give you these 7 sort of key components. And as I said earlier, we've kind of covered the first 6. We've talked about type, we've talked about profile, we've talked about definition and authority, we've talked about strategy and the not self theme in the previous episodes. And so here we have this 7th sort of piece of information, if you will, which is the Incarnation Cross. And here I have my chart up, which would just indicate that I am on this right angle cross of planning. You see 16, 9, 37, 40. And you may have seen this in your own chart and wondered, what is that? How does that get generated or calculated? So that's what we're going to look at today. It's a calculation based on our personality and design Sun-Earth gates. So we can see this 16/9 is my personality Sun and Earth. 3740 is my design Sun-Earth. And that means I'm on the right angle cross of planning. So there are multiple angles. And this is what the other kind of thing we're going to get into with this video is, it's about quarters and angles. In order to understand incarnation crosses, you need to know those 2 fundamental things. And we sort of touched on angles a little bit in the profile video. And if you remember, I'll pull up, do I still have it in here? Yeah, if I go back to our previous episode where we talked about profile, and you recall, we really focused more on what these 2 sets of numbers meant for each of us, depending on our profile, that the first number was our personality and it was our identity, and the second number was from our design side, it was our nature. But what I really didn't focus on too much was all of the information over here and what we're calling geometry. What we get into is that all of those personal profiles are what we call right angle, and then we get this one juxtaposed, which is the 4-1, and then the left angle, which are the remaining 4, which are the transpersonal profiles. And so one of the things we're going to learn about is what this means, this right angle versus juxtaposition versus left angle. And it's some of the technical material that we're going to go through. So that's what I mean when I say angle. And then the other thing is the quarter. There's actually 4 quarters that the Rave Mandala is divided up into. And that's the first thing that we're going to jump into here. So let me reset this. Come back to our title here, Incarnation Cross, Fulfilling Your Purpose. So, as I said, this may be a multiple part episode, but let's see. So I want to take us back to sort of where we began, which is the basic Rave Mandala here that we've been working with throughout the series. And I want to go back to the concept of the 8 primary trigrams that we discussed in understanding what is this. What are these pictures represent, these hexagrams that we're working with in the Rave Mandala? And remember, we started with the first trigram, heaven, which is 3 solid or yang lines. And then we sort of built these 8-fold sequence in a certain order, where the second one is lake, the third one is fire, the fourth was thunder. And then we went over here to wind, water, mountain, and earth. And we constructed them and laid them out in this way because it reveals something very powerful about these 8 symbols, right? Where each one across is a mirror of the other. We see heaven and earth are sort of what we call polarity pairs. 3 solid lines, 3 broken lines. Lake and mountain are polarity pairs. Fire and water, thunder and wind. And this is a fundamental component of how this Rave Mandala is built the way it is. Why we have these gates in this sequence that they're not sequenced 1 through 64 the way they would be in the book, the I Ching book, because that's something called the King Wen sequence. This is a polarity sequence, and as we've mentioned, this goes way back to antiquity. This is a way of laying out the hexagrams in I think, a much more intuitive way in many ways because of this beautiful, elegant pattern that we get. So what we learned was when we looked at the first hexagram here, and we saw that it was these 6 solid lines, what we learned that this is heaven over heaven, right? And that all of the first 8, we learned that this is a eightfold process unfolding. That what we get, the way you build the hexagram is you stack 2 trigrams on top of each other, remember? So we had 1 is heaven over heaven. It's all of these solid lines. And then the next one in the series, 43, is lake over heaven. And we went through this process of putting each of the 8 trigrams on top of heaven, and that built the first 8 hexagrams in the sequence. And so essentially we could then say this first section or sector we could call the heaven sector of the wheel. And then we saw that at gate 10, the pattern then changes, and then lake becomes the denominator. And so 10 is heaven over lake, 58 is lake over lake, and so on. And we built 8 more. And so we could call this the lake sector of the wheel. Likewise, at 13, it repeats again with fire as the denominator. So now we could say this is the fire sector. Then we went to gate 25, and the denominator for those 8 hexagrams becomes thunder. And then recall that when we get to gate 2, something very special happens. It inverts, it flips. The pattern then jumps to earth, and we go earth over earth. And then it goes mountain over earth, and we run it in this sort of counterclockwise way. And so we would say this next sector is the earth sector, so we'll label that as such. And then we get the mountain sector starting with gate 15. Those 8 all have mountain as the denominator, so we'll call this our mountain section. Gate 7, we get the beginning of the water section, so this is going to be our water. And of course, last but not least, at gate 46, we start with the wind section. Sounds like a part of an orchestra, doesn't it? The wind section. But this is a nice way of laying out the wheel and giving us another appreciation, a deeper appreciation that we do have this sort of eightfold division of the wheel, right? These 8 slices, if you will, of the mandala. And by looking at it this way and understanding how this pattern unfolds, we really can understand how all of these gates work. And again, everything's a polarity. So all of the heaven gates are opposite the earth's, the lakes and the mountains, the fire and water, the thunder and wind, the same way we showed these patterns. And this is the beauty and elegance of this layout. And now, one thing to notice is that there's something very special about the beginning of each of these 8 sequences. These 8 gates share something in common. So the first gate, the 10th gate, the 13th gate, the 25th, the 2nd, the 15th, and the 7, and the 46 form this perfect pair of crosses. And what's interesting is that you'll note all of these 8 gates are the gates of the G center. And this is a really fascinating and interesting subject, and one we'll get into more in subsequent episodes. But it's interesting just to note that, you know, the G center, which is our center of love and direction, it's like the identity of the body graph. It's sort of the new central hub of the 9-centered being, if you will. That all of those 8 gates form 2 crosses and are the initiators of each of these 8 phases of the I Ching and of the Rave wheel. So something that's just fascinating, and I remember first sort of, you know, grokking that in a way and going, wow, that's really powerful. And there's more we can learn about that, and we will. But just to make that note, it's something that we're gonna explore in Incarnation Crosses as well. But just a cool point to make, and just something that, you know, as you start to peel the layers on this system, it just keeps revealing itself to be more and more beautiful, I believe, and aesthetically pleasing and profound as you go deeper and deeper in. So kind of a cool thing. And, this is we showed how these are the actual 4, what we would call high holy days of the solar year, right? We've got the 2 equinoxes, the 2 solstices, and then the 4 points between them. So there's a very significant meaning to all of these 8 gates that really dates back to antiquity and is still, of course, alive and well today. But anyway, I like having this layer here and this way of seeing the wheel, because now I feel like we can eliminate the need to show the trigrams, because we understand where they are in the wheel, and we can even eliminate the hexagrams, because we know like that gate 1 is going to be heaven over heaven. We know that gate 2 is earth over earth. We know that gate 15 is earth over mountain, right? Because we know the pattern, we know the code. And that's so key to understanding this, and again, getting a very profound and foundational level. The other thing this does is it gives us a little more room on the wheel to explore the next topic, which is quarters. So essentially, the Rave Mandala is divided up into 4 distinct quarters, each containing 2 of these sort of trigram elements, if you will. Now, if you're like me, when you first heard, the quarters, you're probably going to go, okay, let's start with gate 1, and heaven and lake are going to be quarter 1, and we're going to work around the wheel. And no, because what we find out is that the first quarter, which is known as the quarter of initiation, actually starts here in gate 13, not in gate 1. And again, this is one of those things coming from maybe a system like astrology. You're going to be really confounded by, well, why do we start gate 1? Why is gate 1 in Scorpio? And why is quarter 1 start in the middle of Aquarius at gate 13? And the answers aren't very straightforward. There's not a simple answer to it. But as you start to really understand how the system works, you start to appreciate how all of these components in synthesis really work together in a way that brings out the profundity, I think, of this system. So we're going to start with gate 13, all right? And this is the quarter of initiation. So what is initiation all about? Initiation is purpose fulfilled through mind, right? So these 16 gates, so if we think about initiation, contains the sort of fundamentals of fire and thunder, right? The initiating energy. And this actually aligns and kind of makes sense, right? Like a trial by fire, initiation by fire. These 2 trigrams, fire and thunder, seem to possess a very initiating kind of force, right? So that's a good way of remembering how the quarters lay out, because we can see that each one of them is going to have 2 of these trigram sectors in it. So we initiate through fire and thunder. Now, something that's worth looking at, and I'm going to be showing you something very interesting here. This is the Neutrino platform, which is very exciting. It's a new web-based app from the people who are bringing us Neutrino design. If you use that app, you're familiar with it, you may have heard. They just released the beta version of their new software, which is absolutely brilliant. I am so thrilled to have this as a tool. So excited about what they're doing. And once it's in full release, I probably will do a full video on how amazing this software is, because I do love it. But I do want to just use this amazing feature inside of it. It's something that they call the chart builder. And it's interesting, we can look at, what are the gates that are making up this first quarter, right? And I think it's interesting to look at the gates by quarter. So we start here in gate 13, which of course is in the G center, and then we get gate 49 down in the emotional center, gate 30, gate 55, which is interesting. We get 3 emotional gates all in a row here. Actually, we get 4 in a row, because 37 is in the emotional center. Then we get 63 up in the head. We get 22 in the emotional. We get 36 in the emotional, which is pretty interesting. Almost all the emotional gates, except for 6, are in the first half of this quarter of initiation. So they're technically in what we would call the fire quadrant of our mandala. Interesting, right? And then 25, we get our second G-center gate. And then 17 in the ajna, 21 in the ego center, 51 in the ego center. And what we see right away is we get definition here in this quarter. And let me just add the rest. 42 in the sacral, 3 in the sacral, 27 in the sacral, and then 24 here in the ajna. So this is telling us something I think is interesting. And why is this the quarter of initiation? Well, here it gives us definition because gate 25 and 51 are both in this quarter. Together they create definition, right? The 25-51, which is, drumroll please, the channel of initiation, right? So this is giving us a clue as to why this is the quarter of initiation. It's very interesting to observe that, again, 6 of the 7 emotional gates are here in this first quarter of initiation. And that may be puzzling, you know, and I kind of contemplate, it's like, we are purpose fulfilled through mind, right? It's sort of a mental approach. We would expect maybe a lot of the ajna and head gates or the throat gates maybe to be in this quarter, or this quadrant. But not true, right? All the emotional gates are here, or the majority of them. So that's something to contemplate as we look at these quarters and start to see how the distribution of the gates around the wheel lays out and the deeper meaning that's encoded in this system. So we've got some definition here. I think that's interesting. So there's our quarter of initiation, and now you can start to see, maybe you're seeing these gates a little different. You're starting to look at this quadrant of the wheel and go, interesting. A lot of emotionality is all over here. You also can think about that being in Aquarius and Pisces and Aries and Taurus. So lots to think about, lots to contemplate, but let's move on, and let's move on to the quarter of civilization, the second quarter, Q2 here. And that begins with our second gate, gate 2, Earth over Earth, as we know. And what is civilization all about? Well, this is purpose fulfilled through form, right? So mind to form, right? So there's also a mystical quality to each of these and a mystical keynote. I don't want to get into that. Maybe we'll talk about that in a different episode. But essentially, this is the quarter of civilization. It's about building through form, building civilization. And again, we can take a look at, so what are the gates that compose this second quarter? Let's go back to our chart builder and let's reset that, and let's see what we get when we look at these 16 gates as part of the quarter of civilization. We start with gate 2. Remember, all of them are going to start with a G-center gate, right? Because they're all here in the G-center. So we go from 2 to 23 in the throat. We get gate 8 also in the throat. We get gate 20 also in the throat. All right, so we're seeing something different here, another pattern. Gate 16 in the throat. Gate 35 in the throat. Gate 45 in the throat. Gate 12 in the throat. So in the similar way we saw a lot of the solar plexus gates in the first quarter, now we're getting a lot of the, and we're going to get all of them, as you can see here. The throat gates are going to be in civilization, right? So 15, we get into the mountain sector here with Earth over Mountain, gate 15, G center, 52 in the root, 39 in the root, 53 in the root. So we start to see that there are sometimes there's these sequences of consecutive gates in a same center. 62, we get another throat gate. 56, we get another throat gate. 31, we get another. And at 33, we get the final throat gate. So here's something interesting about the quarter of civilization. All of the throat gates are in this quarter. Very interesting, right? And if you contemplate, what does that mean, right? If the throat is all about manifestation, whether manifesting and expressing verbally or in action, it makes sense that everything that we build through form in civilization gets manifested through the throat. and why all the energy in the body graph is trying to get to the throat for expression so that it can build through this form principle. So that's really fascinating to contemplate. And the other thing that's interesting, though, is that despite having every gate in the throat, there's no definition created in this quarter of civilization, unlike we had when we looked at civilization, where we got activation in the G center and the ego center. Here, no activation, no definition, if you will. So that's really interesting to contemplate as we look at these quarters. I find it fascinating. If you have any insights into what that might mean for you, I'd love to hear it in the comments below. Let me know what you think of how these things lay out. But we're going to keep looking at move on to the third quarter here. And this is known as the quarter of duality. And it begins with the 7th gate. And what is duality about? Well, this is purpose fulfilled through bonding, or we could also say purpose fulfilled through relationships. This is all about building relationships. And here we get water and wind as our sort of primary trigrams. And just to go back, if you think about earth and mountain being of civilization, remember this is a primarily yin part of the wheel, that everything of form and form principle is of the yin nature, right? Form is yin, body is yin, earth is yin, right? So earth and mountain both have this sort of grounded, earthy, solid foundational kind of energy to them, right? Yeah, and they are in the bottom of the wheel, what we would think of for those astrologically minded, oriented towards the 4th house, the foundation, the roots, the beginnings, the foundation of the structure. So that's very interesting. And then when you get to duality, you get water and wind as the two elemental trigrams of this quarter, this quadrant, which I think also, relates to, we think about bonding and relationships, that water does have that quality of being a more emotional nature. So also be interesting, let's take a look at what gates are in this quarter of duality. So we know we're going to start with gate 7 here in the G. We get gate 4 in the ajna. We get gate 29 in the sacral, gate 59 in the sacral, gate 40 in the ego center, and gate 64 in the head. We got 47. Okay, so with 64 and 47, also very interesting, right? 2 consecutive gates that create definition. The 64-47 channel both lie here in consecutive gates in the sign of Virgo. So now we've got mental definition in our relationship quadrant. Interesting. Now here we have the 6, which is the only emotional gate not in the quarter of initiation. And then when we bring the 6 and we see the 6 and the 59 are both in this quadrant, this quarter. So now we've got additional definition. So we've got the head and ajna defined. We've got the emotional center hooked up to the sacral center. And so let's keep going. That's just the first 8, right? This is all what we would call the water section, the water half of this quadrant. And look at all the definition we get just in those 8 gates. That's something really profound to contemplate. That alone, I think, is really interesting. Then we'll keep going. You got 46 in the G center. And now notice too, when we bring the 46 in, that connects the G, so that not only do we get additional definition here, now the G center is part of it. 48 in the spleen, and here's something interesting. We got 48, 57, 32, 50, 28, 44. All in a row. These are all the gates of the spleen. This is the only part of the Rave Mandala that has this functionality where you get these 7 consecutive gates all in one center, the spleen. So if we think about being splenic, again, going back to astrology, all splenic definition comes from Libra and the first half of Scorpio. And again, coming from astrology, I was really fascinated by that. And I don't know if I would have associated necessarily the sign of Libra with the spleen. But here in the system, we're sort of forced to contemplate that in a way. And as I've gone deeper into my understanding of how that functions, it really has opened up a layer of understanding for me of how the signs work in astrology, and by defining them as we do in human design, it's given me a deeper appreciation of Libra and Scorpio and that quadrant of the sky in terms of the zodiacal wheel. So again, just an interesting thing to point out. And when you start to look at these things, right, how the fundamental components work, you really start to understand, like I like to say, this is the under the hood look at the mechanics of the Rave Mandala. So, and I'm going to tell you, spoiler alert, this is the most defining quadrant of the quarters, I should say. And makes sense, right? If this is all about relationships and bonding, of course that the 59-6 is in this quadrant, right? This is the ultimate bonding channel. This is the channel of mating, right? This is, I call it the baby maker, the 59-6. So that makes sense, right? But we also get this definition from, the gate of confusion into formulation, and we also get the 29-46, right? The channel of discovery. So very interesting, which, incidentally, these are both abstract or collective sense circuit channels. And then the 59-6, of course, is in the defense circuit on the tribal circuitry. So just really interesting to see it laid out like that and to sort of appreciate how these quadrants are functioning. Okay, so let's go back to our graphic here and let's look at the fourth quarter. And this is the quarter of mutation. And we start here with gate 1. And so what's mutation all about? Well, this is purpose fulfilled through transformation. Purpose fulfilled through transformation. I've also heard this expressed as purpose fulfilled through spirit, right? So this is where the emphasis is on really transformation. It's on mutation. It's about changing and keeping the evolutionary wheel going, if you will. And, I would say one of the, I talked about sort of there's a mystical component to each one of these quadrants. And this one is about accepting death, right? It's sounds pretty heavy. And the idea that we have heaven and lake in this quadrant, I think there is something very profound and meaningful there that we will unpack in subsequent episodes. But suffice it to say, this is the fourth quadrant, and if we look at the gates here in the quarter of mutation, starting with gate 1 in the G center, we get 43 in the ajna, 14 in the sacral, 34 in the sacral, 9 in the sacral, 5 in the sacral. So there's another batch of sacral gates in a row. We get 26 in the ego. We get 11 in the ajna. We get 10 in the G center, and we see that gives us definition. We get the 3410 activated here, which is on the initiation circuit. So pretty interesting. This is a very survival, life and death kind of channel, if you will. So that may relate to the channel of mutation. Mutation does come through the individual, so this is an individual channel, so that makes sense. The rest of the gates here, we got the 58 in the root, we got the 38 in the root, the 54 in the root, the 61 in the head, the 60 in the root, 41 in the root, a lot of root gates, 19. So that, the preponderance of the root gates are in this fourth quarter, except that 3 consecutive gates we got down here in civilization. So that's interesting to observe. And we have definition here between the sacral and the G center. So 3 of the 4 give us definition. Ironically, it's civilization that doesn't get defined by any of the channels. I found that curious and something to ponder. But yeah, that's the 4 quarters. Now, why is that important in terms of understanding incarnation crosses? It seems like a long prologue, but this is really important because this is where and how our incarnation crosses are derived from. And I'm going to give you a little preview of it. I think I'm going to split this video right around here. So I'm going to show you a preview of how incarnation crosses comes from the quarters. And then in the second video, we'll really dive deep into it. And we're going to see the mechanics of how it works. And it really reveals something really essential about this whole system. And if you can understand that, boy, you really understand what's going on with this wheel and these mechanics. So there we have the 4 quarters. And of course, what's interesting is they begin this 13, the 2, the 7, and the 1. Of course, they're all in the G center. And you see they form this sort of almost like a trident here that goes up through from the 2 to the 1 or the 7 or the 13. And again, I'm going to do a deep dive into the G center. I'm going to do a whole series of videos on each center. It's one of the many things on my growing list of topics to explore here on the channel. But suffice it to say, this is a very profound sense of direction. That's what we get from these 4 gates. They are the gates. We say the G center is the center of direction and love. Well, these are the 4 direction gates in many ways, and the 10-15 and the 25-46 are the 4 love gates. And as we get into incarnation crosses, we are going to find out that these 4 gates of love form the incarnation cross known as the vessel of love. And these 4, the 2, the 1, the 7, and the 13, form an incarnation cross known as the cross of the Sphinx. And so that's where we're going to go in the next video, is we're going to explore actually what we call the cross of the Sphinx. We're going to look at these 4 gates that are the initiators of the 4 quarters. So they have a very special signification. The cross of the Sphinx and the cross of the vessel of love actually are 2 of the crosses that, not that they're more important than the others, but they do have a special signification just by virtue of their placement in the wheel. Let me just say that. So, sphinxes aren't special, or vessels aren't special, although they kind of are, but we'll get into why that is. But essentially, we see that 13, 7, 1, and 2, this is the cross of the Sphinx. And so if you were born here in the middle degrees in the 13th gate, say you were born in, early February, and your sun would be in Aquarius, you have the sun in the 13th gate, that means you're coming in on the cross of the Sphinx, okay? And so let's say, for instance, you came in on the first line. So you're 13th gate, first line of the Sphinx. Okay, well, that means your personality sun, we would call that a 13-1, 13th gate, first line, okay? Now, knowing that data, we also know that your Earth is going to be exact opposite over here in the gate 7, and it's also going to be in the first line. So your personality Earth is in gate 7, line 1, as we write as 7-1, as we learned, right? Now, here's where it gets really interesting. So essentially, this is a right angle cross. If we look at these 4 gates, they form this perfect right angle cross in the mandala. Now, when we want to look for our design sun, we calculate that by going 88 degrees of the sun before the birth, and that's where the design sun is. And here's where it's really fascinating, right? This 88 degree number becomes incredibly important, because if you go a full 90 degrees, well, we know that would be in gate 1, line 1, right? And you'd have this perfect 90 degree angle between the suns, the 2 suns, if you will. But of course it's not, it's 88 degrees. So, at gate 1, line 2, we'd be about 89 degrees. But the first time you can really get to an 88 degree difference is in line 3. So we could say the personality sun here would be in gate 1, line 3. Okay? That's 88 degrees before this sun in 13.1. And so likewise, we know that our design Earth is going to be down here in gate 2, and that's also going to be in gate 3, in the exact polar opposite. So we would say the design Earth is in 2.3, gate 2, line 3, right? And this is how this is the kind of the nomenclature that we all use when someone asks you, what's your human design? You usually give them, your profile. I'm a 1.3, I'm a 3.5, I'm a 6.2. You'll give them your definition, whether you're a sacral generator or you're an emotional projector. And then you'll give them your cross. I'm a, like I would explain to you, my shorthand for you would be, I'm a 3.5 emotional manifesting generator on the right angle cross of planning. And that's an amazingly compressed way of telling anyone who knows this information a lot about me and about my design. So we learn to use this language as part of how we share and express ourselves and explain ourselves through this system. So it's really cool to see how the mechanic works. Do you understand how important this is? What we are going to get into, known as a right angle cross. And in the next episode, I'm really going to break down how this works mechanically, and we'll go through each of the possible 12 profiles that can come being born in the 13th gate. So over the course of a 5.5 day period, the sun will move through the 13th gate, from in early February every year, and it'll move through all 12 of these possible combinations, right? It means, okay, I'm coming in on the 13th gate. And so one of the things that's fascinating is that when you look at your incarnation cross, this combination of just these two planetary placements, your sun, earth on both sides, gives you an arm, if you will, in all 4 quadrants. And we all have this. All of us incarnate. And this is the beauty of this 88-degree calculation between the personality and the design placements, right? It's always going to give each and every human being a placement in all 4 quadrants. But we're always going to orient to our personality sun. Wherever we come in on, right, that's always going to be the orienting point, sort of the compass. It's sort of our personal magnetic north, if you will. And then the other 3 points on the compass will fill in our story in a way. But we're going to learn to really understand this personality sun as being, how we fulfill our purpose. So let's just, as a way of wrapping up this episode, we'll just briefly kind of look at what does this mean for a soul here coming in as a 1-3 cross of the Sphinx in the 13th gate. Well, we know that the gate 13 is the gate of the listener, right? Here it is in the G center. We know that it's part of what we call the sensing circuit, the collective sensing circuit. So, its keynote is all about sharing. It wants to share information, right? Here, it wants to give direction to that sharing by being a good listener. It's going to be very acute to hearing from its environment information that can be useful in helping, especially oriented to the past. It's going to listen to stories. It's going to listen to the old tales, and it's going to try to interpret them in a new way. And of course, if it's coming in as a first line, what is it going to do? It's going to investigate. It's going to be very introspective about how it listens. It's going to be listening for clues. It's going to be very sensitive to what it hears in its environment. So you can begin to see how just getting this little bit of data and just using the simple keynotes that we're learning to use from the system, we can get a very, very profound understanding of the purpose of this soul, right? And again, where are we? We're in the quarter of initiation. And as we just learned, we just added a new distinction here, a new keynote. This is purpose fulfilled through mind. So all of this will be of a mental orientation. This soul's purpose will be fulfilled through thinking about right? Thinking about what it's hearing, thinking about the story, sharing itself mentally. This would be very different than, say, if you were born with your sun in Taurus here in the second gate. Now your purpose is fulfilled through form, right? You're going to have the same 4 gates activated, but your focus is going to be on the 2, not on the 13. You are all going to be all about your own individual direction in life, right? And it's all about empowerment. Where here, this is about sharing. This soul will, their purpose will be fulfilled through mentally sharing what it investigates, line 1. And of course, it also has that 3rd line, so it's also going to hear and listen for what isn't correct. It's going to hear and listen for what doesn't work, and it's going to share that as well. It's going to have to mentally contemplate the trial and error process. It's going to investigate, and it's going to find out, the old stories that we thought were the foundations, guess what? Those don't work anymore, right? There's the 1 investigating and the 3 going, nope, shit's broke. We need a new foundation, right? So fascinating how we can look at, as we start to add these layers and dimensions, the insight we can get into really understanding ourselves, if this is your chart, or a friend, a loved one, or just understanding how humanity works, how we all work. I think that is an incredible gift. And so that's why I have such enthusiasm for this system, and why I'm so focused on sharing this at this time, because I think it's really becoming incredibly important that we understand how this all works as we all move together through these unprecedented times that we're living in. And there's just no question about it. So that's kind of, so we looked at quarters. We're starting to understand angles here. Like, this is the right angle. And as we go into the next episode, we're going to see how, as we progress through the 12 profiles, we go from a right angle to a fixed to a left angle. And you're going to see visually and graphically how that works mechanically, and how we can interpret that and see how in one gate we get these 12 different sort of interpretations of the theme of that hexagram. So we'll go through this gate 13, the gate of the listener, and we're going to see 3 different approaches to listening, and how each soul, and all from a mental, purpose fulfilled through the mind. Right? They'll all have a mental orientation, but depending on the angle, depending on the profile, they will mentally investigate, or mentally externalize, or they will mentally, formulate differently based on their role, based on their profile. Really fascinating. So it really dovetails nicely into the last episode, and you can see how we're getting much deeper into the system, and it's starting to reveal itself, hopefully, to you as something that is, it's really, I know I keep using this word, rich and juicy and evocative and aesthetically pleasing and elegant, and it is all of those things. So, sorry, that's just my gate 16 of enthusiasm. That's my orientation. That's my purpose in life, is to fulfill the form, creating these videos with enthusiasm. So, I hope you appreciate that. I hope you're getting something out of this in the entire series. I'll try to put out the second part of this video within a few days. I'm hoping to get to it. So, till next time. Sat Nam, everyone.